way, and if they get the houses out of the way and could get a telescope over the hill, you'd see the site of Nonsuch Palace. And Nonsuch Palace was the favourite home of Queen Elizabeth I. And it was like a checkerboard building, dark and light stone. And it was an extraordinary building with sort of fanciful towers and an amazing garden. It was just really badly built and fell apart, basically, so they had to abandon it in the end. So that's one thing. And then just up the hill here, where our local church is, behind there is the river, the Hogsmill River, and just behind where the church is where Millais painted Ophelia. But also the Hogsmill River is really well known because it was a site of gunpowder mills. And all the way along the Hogsmill River from 1589, I think, there were gunpowder mills which would regularly blow their tops, literally, because the roofs were built so that the roofs could fly off easily if there was an explosion without destroying the rest of the building. So there are two connections there. And so we're going to go back to the time of Gloriana, the time of the Virgin Queen. And this is my story of the Virgin Queen and the Merchant. And some of it is based in history, some of it is fanciful, and it's up to you to work out which bits are which. When Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud arrived in London, he left his ship at the dock and stepped into a carriage. Through the carriage window, he could see the English prisoners being taken out of the ship's hold and taken out onto dry land. But strangely, for a merchant who was there to sell, Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud did not receive any payment. He did not receive any ransom for the English prisoners. Their names were just taken by an official, and then they were allowed to go. But Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud sat back in the coach. Well, sat back. It was quite crowded in there. But as a date merchant, he had 2 barrels of dates in the carriage with him, as well as a translator. See, Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud didn't speak English, and he needed to communicate. So he had a translator who could speak Arabic and Italian. So they relied on having somebody on English soil who could also speak Italian to speak to the translator, so the translator could speak to Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud, and he could, etc., etc. And off they set, through the streets of London, across the potholed streets, which those of us who live in London today can tell you are still there. Probably deeper potholes than they were in the reign of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. And he made his way out of London and into Surrey, a date merchant, going to the palace of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. And the date merchant travelled through the fields of Surrey until they turned into the driveway leading up to Nonsuch Palace, a checkerboard in front of them. Instead of going into the palace, Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud and his translator were taken into the formal gardens, with servants bringing the barrels of dates with them. And there, in the formal gardens of Nonsuch Palace, there was a platform, and over the platform was a fine silk canopy, and sitting was the Queen, Elizabeth I, surrounded by her ladies in waiting and guards, of course, and standing next to her, a very well-dressed man with a very finely trimmed beard and moustache, who was covering a painting with a silk drape. The man who was well-dressed and with the finely trimmed beard and moustache presented Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud to Queen Elizabeth. "Your Majesty, may I present the date merchant from Marrakesh, who brings his goods to show you, for you to appreciate." Now, Queen Elizabeth I spoke Italian. She spoke many languages, and so she was able to communicate with Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud, the date merchant, through the translator. Abdul al-Wahid bin Masoud instructed the lids to be taken off the barrels of dates, and then one of Elizabeth's servants came and chose a few of the dates themselves, placed them on a dish, and took them to the queen. But before she took them, one of her servants chose one and bit into it. When he didn't writhe on the ground in agony, the plate was offered to the queen, and she took a date, and she bit into the succulent flesh and felt the sweet juice upon her tongue, and a smile played about her lips, but it was betrayed by the frown on her forehead. And she turned to al-Wahid ben Masoud, and through the translator she said, "This is delicious fruit. It is sweet. I can feel its juice sliding down my throat. It is delicious, but it will not defeat Catholic Spain." al-Wahid ben Masoud bowed to the queen. And then he went up to one of the barrels and he hugged it with his arms. And then his fingers pressed and there was a click. And the servants came forward and lifted the top off the barrel, the top that contained the dates. And then the servants tipped the barrel towards the queen so she could see the saltpeter that was being smuggled by al-Wahid ben Masoud, the date merchant. Saltpeter that would charge cannon, that would charge musket, that would help defeat Catholic Spain. And Gloriana smiled. And she said, al-Wahid ben Masoud, you dissemble. You pretend to be a date merchant, and yet you smuggle, under the eyes of Spanish and Portuguese ships, this saltpeter to England. How do I know that I can trust you? And al-Wahid ben Masoud, the date merchant, said, "Then your majesty, test me." And the queen said, "Then I have 3 questions for you, al-Wahid ben Masoud. And if, date merchant, you can answer these 3 questions, I will indeed trust you. My first question is this: how long would it take me to travel around the world?" al-Wahid ben Masoud stroked his beard and said, "Your Majesty, I think it would take you 24 hours to travel round the world." And the Virgin Queen looked at him and turned her head on one side and said, "How so, date merchant?" And he said, "Why, Your Majesty, all you would have to do is take the hand of the sun and travel with the sun, and you will surely go round the world in 24 hours. And the Queen smiled and nodded, and she said, "Then answer this question, al-Wahid ben Masoud. How much am I worth?" Now that's a dangerous question to answer. To answer anyone in power, to answer a monarch, Queen of England, how much you think she's worth? al-Wahid ben Masoud didn't even stroke his beard. He just came immediately with an answer and gave it back to the Queen. And he said, "You, Your Majesty, are worth 29 pieces of silver." Gloriana, Elizabeth of England, the woman who had overseen the defeat of the Spanish Armada, a woman who enjoyed the luxury of treasure plundered from Spanish galleons, worth 29 pieces of silver. Her face turned to thunder, and she stared at him. And as her eyes buried into the date merchant, she said, "Tell me, how can I, Queen of England, be only worth 29 pieces of silver?" And al-Wahid ben Masoud, the date merchant, said, "Your Majesty, in your religion, your prophet was betrayed, was sold for 30 pieces of silver. I would not insult you or your Majesty's religion by saying you are worth the same as your prophet, but surely if he is worth 30 pieces of silver, your Majesty must be worth 29. The cloud cleared from Elizabeth's face, and she smiled, and she said, "Very good. But see if you can answer this, my final question, al-Wahid ben Masoud, the date merchant. Tell me, Elizabeth, Queen of England, Gloriana, tell me what I am thinking. And Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood said, Your Majesty, you are thinking that I am Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood, date merchant. But I am not. Surely my name is Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood, but I am no merchant, Your Majesty. I am sent here as ambassador for the King of Fez, Sultan of Morocco. I am here to sign a treaty with you, with England, so that we may stand together against Catholic Spain. And Queen Elizabeth leant back into her chair and put her hand to her mouth and said, My goodness, how you have fooled me, Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood, ambassador. And she turned to the man next to her, Sir Robert Cecil, the man known as Elizabeth's spymaster, and said, How could this happen? That this man could stand before Elizabeth, before the Queen of England, and pretend to be that which he is not? How could you allow this to happen, Sir Robert? And Sir Robert Cecil looked at the Queen and said, Your Majesty, may I show him the painting? Of course, said the Queen. So Sir Robert Cecil withdrew the silk from the painting. It was a painting that he had commissioned of Queen Elizabeth that is now called the Rainbow Portrait. And in it, the 70-year-old Queen is actually ageless. But she stands there as Gloriana, and she wears an orange gold dress into which is sewn the decoration of eyes and ears. And Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood looked at the dress in the painting and smiled. And Sir Robert Cecil said, Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood, ambassador, Elizabeth hears all. Elizabeth sees all. So it is up to you to work out which parts of that story were history and which were not. But I can tell you for truth that Abdul al-Wahid bin Masood, the ambassador for Morocco, arrived at the court of Elizabeth I in the year 1600, having travelled in disguise as a merchant. But that is my story of the Virgin Queen and the merchant, and that is how I have told it to you.